Welcome back once again, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt. Thank you so much for joining us for Shoneh Halachos Part 2. So, I mentioned that if anybody wants to be a sponsor, they should reach out. And lo and behold, Baruch Hashem, we have our first sponsor who is anonymous, but he shared the following message. I know I'm not the only one who eagerly anticipates the next year. It has given me an appreciation not only for Rav Chaim Kanievsky, but for how vast the Torah really is. This is a great chos that you are giving to Klal Yisrael, and I'm thrilled to therefore be a part of it by being the first one to offer a sponsorship for this year. The Torah and the Simcha created should be for Refuah Shalema, for Shifra Bracha, Bas Rachel. The Shiurim have been enlightening and entertaining all at once, so the Shir should be a Schos Refuah Shalema again for Shifra Bracha, Bas Rachel. Okay, let's start with an email that we got commenting on the recent Shoneh Halachos discussion. And the person, he wanted to make a macha protest about what was mentioned by Rabbi Yosef Cairo. We were discussing shikha, forgetting, and Rabbi Eliezer could discuss how he already discussed this in a previous episode, a letter from the Rambam. But this person wasn't happy with the way we mentioned that Rabbi Yosef Cairo perhaps forget. He said to imply memory loss in such a figure is improper. So, Eliezer, do you want to respond to that right off the top?
Yes, so I will just mention one thing for this question. It's a very valid question. The quote that I brought about possible forgetting or changing of the mind of the Beis Yosef was from Rav Shmuel Vital, from Rav Chaim Vital, his father, great contemporary, a younger contemporary of the Yosef Cairo. But just to put in context, I said, but even though I'm trying to avoid going in tangents, just one makar relating specifically to Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and that is that the Beis Yosef, as it was very well known, Shavuos is coming upon us faster than we realize, had a Magid, and that everyone knows. One of the things we stay up on Shavuos night is the whole story with the Beis Yosef and his Magid. So the Beis Yosef had this Magid, however the Magid works. But anyway, in Shulchan Orach it says, bottom line, that in Rosh Hashanah, one should eat meat on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, makes sense. It's Psukim and Ezra. In the Magid of the Beis Yosef, it says, interesting thing, do not eat meat. So Achrayim already point out what's going on here. How could he forget an open pasuk in Ezra? Furthermore, it's a Gemara in Chulin and a Mishnah in Shvius also. The Gemara in Chulin, Pei Gimel, says one of the 4 times a year that we shecht and you have to eat meat is Rosh Hashanah. So what's pshat? That the Magid said something against the Gemara. Now, about the stira between the Magid and the Beis Yosef is its own discussion. That's a tangent. But just for our purposes is, a shocking statement to some is found in the Radal, Reb David Luria, in the Sefer Maimer Kadma Sefer Hazayah, where you heard from Rav Chaim Volozhiner. And to preface this, Rav Chaim Volozhiner knew very well about Magidim. He had conversations with his Rabbi, the Gra, about Magidim more than once. He quotes the Magid of the Beis Yosef a few times in his Nefesh HaChaim, and he was known great Makubal, so he doesn't need any eskamas from us. He says the following about the Beis Yosef's Magid and about this topic. Shevadai me'arav Beis Yosef shikha ba'isei rega ha-mishnah hi. Ay hayeloi zal is a rifyun b'chazara v'ayin asher alidei kein loy hi'ira kayach mishnah zu gam ba'magid ba'isei shah. And it triggered that the Magid gave him false information, and because there was Rifyun and Chazara in the Beis Yosef at the time when this statement came down in through the Magid through him. Now, it might sound very shocking, Rav Chaim Volozhiner saying this, but in Kabbalah, Makairis such as Rav Moshe Cordovero, Rav Chaim Vital, and others, they also say this when they're talking about Magidim. Akopanim, without getting into any more, what we see over here is Rav Chaim Volozhiner saying there's a possibility that the Beis Yosef forgetting could even be by someone as great as the Beis Yosef. And I mentioned in the first presentation over here with the Rambam, that the Rambam in a letter says he forgot. It seems from what we see in this letter, which is an authentic letter, the Rambam forgot his Makairis for some things until he found it, and that was the story that we quoted then.
Okay, and I'll just add, tell me if you agree. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to understand this shikha the way we understand it today with our friends and we forgot something. There could be something on a higher level. I mean, to say there's the first Gemara, obviously, and you can't comprehend this on a human level. Moshe Rabbeinu says shachachti, right? But whatever that means, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu is Moshe Rabbeinu. We can't even talk, So obviously it means whatever that shikha means. There was some kind of something minashamayim, whatever it is. That at that point they didn't have
Right.
that makar. Is that the sphere?
It's for sure fear, especially the further back you go in time. No question. When we talk about Avos, Moshe Rabbeinu, Tanaim, Amaram, but there's for sure such a thing out there. That's not even a doubt.
Okay, fine. And one more question to address, and perhaps you'll address this in the actual conversation, is somebody sent the following question. He wanted to know what the Rav Chaim Zatzal say about the Orach Hashulchan. He says it always bothered me that the Olam has raised the Mishnah Berurah well over the Orach Hashulchan for several reasons, and he lists his reasons. And obviously, we're not here, mi anu, to be machnis our small heads into these bein harim hagadolim. But the Rav Chaim talking about the Orach Hashulchan, is that something you'll discuss today?
So I already alluded to more than once, just briefly, that so there's 2 points over here that just to say very quickly is as follows. It seems, and I've heard this from different people, I've seen a little bit, but not a much. What bothers people is that in Bnei Brak at least, and we have Rav Chaim Kanievsky saying this, and it's the Chazon Ish, which we quoted parts of it last time, is that the Mishnah Berurah Zeichel Eskab B'chol Yisrael Hu HaPaisik HaAchrim B'Dareinu B'Chelik Orach Chaim. So what bothers people is what's the story with the Orach Hashulchan. There's a Chibur Orach Hashulchan written mamish in the same time. So number one is I had heard, and hearing is not necessarily from a valid source, but I heard that the Chazon Ish had problems with Orach Hashulchan and stuff like that. The truth is that looking through Rav Chaim Kanievsky's Seforim, you will see that Rav Chaim Kanievsky has no problem with Orach Hashulchan. He's familiar with him, and he uses him keseder in other chalakim of Shulchan Aruch all the time. He's machri like him. He never says any bad things about him. If the Chazon Ish wasn't into him, or even said something zilzalik about him, a zilzal in their madregas, to me, so to speak, he would never really mention him. In Orach Hashulchan Asid, which is relating to Zraim, Rav Chaim Kanievsky uses it extensively in the Derech Emunah. Not that he's passing like every one of them, but he's using him as a person to discuss. So the sentiment that I get from looking in Rav Chaim Kanievsky, not Torah Shebal Peh, from Torah Shebeksav of Rav Chaim Kanievsky's Torah, that he does not have a problem with the Orach Hashulchan really. In Orach Chaim, as far as a Paisik Achron, the Messiah of the Chazon Ish, for whatever reasons, and Rav Chaim Kanievsky is based on that Messiah, was the Mishnah Berurah. Now, just to say here, because I fear that people will comment, so just to preempt the comments, a drop, is as follows. The Orach Hashulchan saw the Mishnah Berurah, the Cholapachas and Hilchos Shabbos. He quotes it sometimes openly. Sometimes he's referring to statements in it without saying openly. Rav Eitam Henkin, in his work, Tarich Lefanei Shulchan, which I had the schus to be involved with the producing of the book, has a small chapter about this. Chaval, he was probably going to write a much bigger chapter, but we don't have all the materials, but we have some, and it's found a little bit's found in the book. And he shows such a thing that the Orach Hashulchan seems sometimes to be referred to Mishnah Berurah. They got along. They're both Litvaks. I don't know. We don't know if they have any contact personally with each other, but we have no reason to assume there was any fights. As far as we know, no one ever found that there was any such things, any controversies, that they're both on different sides. Even the Orach Hashulchan, one has to understand, is a Talmud of Alajin, a brother-in-law of the Netziv. He's one of the Gedolei Hadar of the time, one of the active, most Rabbanim. He's involved with many of the controversies. A very, very well-known Paisik, people writing in Chuvas. And besides, he also wrote this incredible work called Orach Hashulchan, which we found that after he died, he also wrote called Orach Hashulchan Asid. So basically, he wrote systematic halacha work on Dalit Chelkei Shulchan Aruch, including Zraim, Kachim, and Tyrus. Unheard of things since the Rambam. Anyway, if in certain circles, people, Talmidim of Rav Moshe, say over there, Rav Moshe was very into that you go like the Orach Hashulchan over the Mishnah Berurah. Rav Henkin, who also said similar type of things, but both Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin were also very into the Mishnah Berurah. Rav Henkin knew the Mishnah Berurah Baal Peh. So they had their Messiah, and there are definitely people, I've heard also people from Talmid and Rav Ruderman saying over there, Rav Ruderman also said a similar thing, that the Orach Hashulchan was the Paisik and Litva. The conversation, this is obviously telling a lot of hearsay and possibilities, but whatever. there's no question that L'Shem Shamayim, both of these chiburim were incredible works, and they helped. They're going on different approaches and different methods. Not for now, not this. We're trying to keep the podcast this to Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Just to mention one last thing about this is that there seems to be a zilzul. This is biksav a little bit, that some people feel that the reason about that they're trying to look, why is it that Rav Chaim Kanievsky is not into the Hashulchan per se? Let's say for Rav Chaim, why didn't he write a sikkum of the Hashulchan? Or the Chazon Ish, when he lists his paiskim, he doesn't list the Hashulchan in the list. So they look, and they, based on this Messiah that doesn't really exist anywhere, which we don't have, but they say something to the effect that, oh, look, these Mizrahi people, they're looking for a paisik to hang the hat on, that he's more kuladik than the Mishnah Berurah, such as the Hashulchan, and there's a new revival for the Hashulchan, and it's incha chutzpah g'dayla yaisem mizet to say such a thing about one of the g'dayla paiskim the Hashulchan. I've seen it a little bit. I've seen young people writing about the Hashulchan because of all this hearsay to try to say, oh, the Hashulchan, it must be something's up, so let's find the problematic thing, like, who are you to talk about this? I'm saying Hashulchan was one of the great paiskim before the war. Anyway, Adkan, more than enough off the topic of this this Indian, but this is a point worth to point out to avoid any more problems or questions about this thing.
Okay, so we're going to dive back in. Rabbi Brodt did not have a chance to finish up on the Shoneh Halachos, and as we say, thank you again for the sponsor. It should be Refuah Shalema. And again, any questions or comments, feel free to email eliezerbrot@gmail.com, myself, Shwed, SEHWEDM @OU.org. Okay, so Eliezer, jump right into what you wanted to add to the last podcast.
Okay, so just a few points. One is that it's very interesting. I noticed the lashon in the Hagdama of the Shoneh Halachos, when he talks about the Mishnah Berurah, he says what's his style of a sefer. He throws in, it's going to be kederach hasefer Chaye Yadam. And although the truth is, it's not really like I mentioned briefly last time, it's not really like the Chaye Adam. The Chaye Adam gives much more meat, so to speak. He says more reasoning behind a certain psukim, even in the top part. Forget about the Mishras Adam. But there's a special thing going on over here, which is that there was a chashivus in Lita Bechlal, and the Chazon Ish and the Stipler were very into the Chachmas Adam / Chaye Adam. There's a famous letter of the Chazon Ish, where the Chazon Ish writes, it's quoted in relating to other controversy, the controversy that letter was written about. When he talks about, he says, Ein lanu lintais, to steer away from Midivri Hagoyin Chachmas Adam shekava besifroi shemenhagenu v'chulu. And then he says, the sifroi his spashet b'doyer b'chol eretz lita. And then he continues in the letter whatever he's talking about. The Chazon Ish was very into the Chachmas Adam in general. The Stipler I also saw was very into the Chaye Adam, Chachmas Adam, and also I recently read an interview about Rav Gedalia Nadel, similar thing, when Yeridea, to go with all the psakim of the Chachmas Adam when possible. And just to mention one last source, is there's obviously many sources, and it's its own conversation about the Chaye Adam and Chachmas Adam, but I came across recently, Betzalel Rakov writes that, he was from England, he writes, how should one paskin? He says the Seforim, Chaye Adam, the Chachmas Adam, he was machshir them very much, and he was paskin like them, halacha l'maisa, and he gave shiurim on them. Rav Chaim also rather gave shiurim on the Chaye Adam before he wrote his Mishnah Berurah. Akopanim, the Sefer was very important, and that's why he's throwing out that he's copying on some level, the Kitzer level, making it accessible to the Chaye Adam. That's why Rav Chaim Kanievsky is being madgish this pract. Okay, that Adkan for that was one other point that I wanted to mention relating to the introduction.
Okay. So you mentioned last time the Shoneh Halachos was sort of a sikum, not a sikum, I don't know if that's the right word, but focused on bringing out it was a tamsis, maybe that's a better word, of the Mishnah Berurah and the Chazon Ish. Anything else you want to add about the Chazon Ish? Spend a lot of time on Mishnah Berurah, maybe focus on the Chazon Ish a little bit more.
Yeah, so two things. One is, two things I wanted to mention. One is that the Chazon Ish and the Mishnah Berurah, so I recently came across a few different stories, how I mentioned that there's the Maisa Ish. A lot of times in someone's nifter, so they come out with material, and then sometimes a few times and more material. Maisa Ish, many years after the Chazon Ish was nifter, they started putting out these volumes of material about the Chazon Ish, And then they put out 4 volumes, and everyone thought they stopped. And then they made an index, and they put out volume 5 afterwards, and then a 6, and then a 7. In one of the volumes, they have a ton of information just written from Rav Chaim Kanievsky about the Chazon Ish. So there he talks about a certain shayla that he had. He says he asked the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish said, let's bring out a Mishnah Berurah, and then he paskin based on the Mishnah Berurah. And there's other such stories in the Archas Ravenu and in the Mais Ish that the Chazon Ish had was very into, even though he does, we mentioned last week, he argues on the Mishnah Berurah many times that the Mishnah Berurah was his go-to sefer to look at first before talking about something. But that's one aspect of Shoneh Halachos, and that's where we mentioned the Shoneh Halachos and the Mishnah Berurah aspect. But besides for bringing down the Chazon Ishes in Orach Chaim, let's say, or other places that might be relevant, I was looking. I have not to be magdim. I cannot say that the Shoneh Halachos was a sefer that was on my table or that I spent a lot of time looking at it. In recent weeks, I started looking at it more and trying to figure out what to say. Fine. After I came up with some different things, all of a sudden it pops out to me. I'm looking at a sif in Shimon Yud Ches, and then I see he brings a psak from the Chazon Ish, Shebesayf Sefer Menucha Nechonah. I'm like, oh wow! And Baruch Hashem just gave me something to talk about. As follows like this: and I'll explain the significance relating with the Chazon Ish specifically. Many years ago, while learning Hilchos Shabbos, I come across this. Reb Zevin wrote a piece, and in the piece he refers to a Sefer Menucha Nechonah, and he says some type of interesting thing from this Menucha Nechonah. I went to track it down. I get it. The Kitzer, it's a Sefer from a Rav in Germany who he's born in the 1860s. He dies in 1940, right after he came to Eretz Yisrael. His name was Rav Chaim Bieberfeld. Anyway, it's a small Kitzer Sefer written for the masses. I think it was originally written in German for Hamoinam to learn halachos, modern day halachos. Okay, very, very nice, sweet sefer, and it had a few pieces that's how I got to it. Rav Zevin quoted a certain way, how he said a certain thing, and that's why it sparked me to look at. Anyway, eventually the sefer comes to the attention of Rav Shlomo Buber from Bnei Brak, and he puts it out with different psakim and additions after it's translated from the German into Hebrew. Then we're talking in Bnei Brak. It's coming out in Bnei Brak. So at one point, I believe it was in the 60s, maybe even earlier, Rav Kalman Kahana, he also added in a few pages of psakim from the Chazon Ish. And seems, and there's about 4 or 5 pages in here, which has fascinating psakim that he had a Messiah from the Chazon Ish. So much so, these psakim, the few pages over here, the Chazon Ish checked over every single psak in here, and this is why Rav Chaim Kanievsky is bringing down, for example, in Siman Shin Yud Ches, a psak about what? Shimush b'chashmal. This is one of the first places where the Chazon Ish talks about chashmal on Shabbos and his famous shitas. Now, in Shin Chav Vav, come across that he also brings a Menucha Nechonah, and then he throws you in the following piece of information. Rav Greineman says that the Chazon Ish went over carefully these psakim, that he's justifying why he could bring this down. The answer is because this is coming from Rav Kalman Kahana. Now, the Rav Kalman Kahana was very close with the Chazon Ish, and Lamashal, he has a Sefer in Hilchos Nida, which became for many, many years a sefer that many Chassanim used to use when they learned Hilchos Nida, and in it, the Chazon Ish also went through it and has certain psakim in there that are quoted from this sefer from Rav Kalman Kahana. Now, this sefer from Nechonah, just to mention mamish briefly, 2-3 other points. Besides, I mentioned there with Rav Dublitsky updating the sefer. Rav Shlomo Zalman writes very, very positive about the sefer. Which can be found in one of the later editions of this Menucha Nechonah, where the son wrote a whole history of his father, how a tremendous person he was. And then Reb Zevin has, like Kedarka, one of his incredible book reviews about the Sefer, showing the chashivas of the Sefer. And he writes, one of the fascinating, important parts of this Sefer is the psakim of the Chazon Ish. Besides that, the Etzem Sefer is Gevaldik, and that's how I got to the Sefer, because of Reb Zevin using it in a different Sefer of his. But he says, Arba Amudim Taifis, the special halachas gedolos we have from here that are mamish negate to the Metzius. And even though in the Seforim of the Chazon Ish, we see him as a great gadol b'Torah, and Kiyadur of Zevin wrote about the Chazon Ish b'Arichos, But we see over here we see the Chazon Ish's knowledge and technical aspects of modern day Shilas, says Reb Zevin, in these 4 pages of Psukim, and that's why it's very significant. This is where the Chazon Ish, his sheet is about electricity become famous from, and that's what Reb, what's his name, Rav Chaim Kanievsky is bringing down in here in Derech Emunah. In his Shoneh Halachos. And it's interesting is that Zevin at the time when he wrote his book review in the 1940s writes, so at that time it was mamash a small little tzibur. Over time it became a much bigger tzibur. Okay, and one last prat relating to this Menucha Nechonah is that many times I always wonder if I look for a sign that I'm supposed to be doing this or whatever. So I randomly pull out a Sefer in this room. I don't know if you can see, but it has a lot of Seforim in here. And I open up a Sefer, which I took it down for a completely different reason. It was buried behind the various piles. And I open it up for something else. And then I see that they have, actually, the Chazon Ish wrote more ha'aris for the Menucha Nechonah that didn't get into all the different versions of the Menucha Nechonah, based on a different draft of these ha'aris. And this is in this series that seems to still be coming out called Gnazim V'Tshuvas Chazon Ish Volume Hey. Anyway, that adkan the prat about the Chazon Ish and the Chazon Ish and the Shoneh Halachos, what more information one could find in this Sefer about that.
Okay, Eliezer, you shared with me on the phone that you have a theory in what prompted Rav Chaim to write specifically at that specific time the Shoneh Halachos. Maybe you want to share your theories with the audience.
Okay, so I'm going to share a theory. The theory is it's a theory. It does not mean it's true. It's just a possibility to make life interesting. Even if the theory is not true, the information still is a little interesting, I hope. And as we already were magdim that we try to go on some tangents along the way, so we'll learn about some tangents anyway. My theory is as follows. Looking at the dating of the Shoneh Halachos, I noticed now, and one other point before I get to the theory is that I saw in the Rav Chaim's son, which I've already quoted a few times, about his father, and he sometimes says, "Why did my father write such and such a sefer?" So he says, "I don't know. Sometimes my father didn't tell me. I'm going to guess certain events happened. So I'm going up the derech of the Rav Chaim's son for the Mishnah Berurah. I'm using that over here for the Shoneh Halachos, although the Shoneh Halachos says his reasons, so those reasons are for sure true. I'm adding to the mix another possible Nechonah. Now, what's that Nechonah is I'm looking at the Sefer, and I'm looking at the dates when it first comes out, and I see the year is in the 1960s. It comes out in 1967, Shoneh Halachos. Okay. All of a sudden it clicked that in 1965, a Sefer came out in Eretz Yisrael, which shook the whole Eretz Yisrael. It immediately became a bestseller, sold thousands and thousands of copies, and this is the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso. At the age of 38, Yeshua Neuvart wrote this work, which eventually became the classic, and for until today, everyone has it. It's in every house, America, Israel. It's translated into English also, and it's become okay. So it became an instant classic. Already right away, it wins the Rav Kook Prize, which in those days it still exists, I think. I'm not sure if it exists today, but it existed for many years, where a bunch of people pick which is the best sefer, and in that time, the judges, one of the judges was Rav Zevin, and he wrote up why he and the other judges came to the conclusion that the sefer is proper. Amongst the things is it's how it's written, amazing, and it deals with for the first time all the complicated modern shilas. Even though the Mishnah Berurah is the Mishnah Berurah, but there's many new shilas that kept on coming up. And even though it's a short period of time, but a lot happened and continues to happen as we see. So Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso was the first such sefer to deal with many of these issues head on. And the style and many other things about the Sefer attracted it, and he won the prize and became very famous. Okay. Now, less known, also significant is that even though he was a young 38-year-old person writing a monumental halachic work, he was also a Talmud Muvak of the great Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he wrote the Sefer at the time. Now, why did he choose to write the Sefer? So it seems to be already well known, and he writes about this in the introduction in the newest edition of the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso, that he was where he was during World War II for many years. He hid out in Holland. A whole life is how he got there, and Shabbos He had a Mishnah Berurah Hilchos Shabbos. That was one of the only Seforim he had. He mastered it, and different schusim of being Nizer on Shmiras Shabbos, he held that he's going to make his business to work on Hilchos Shabbos, and which eventually he does, and he created this work that he did. Okay. Now, what I found fascinating is as follows. It turns out that it was known that there was controversy with the Sefer, and there was askamas that certain people backed off of the askamas, and certain psakim became famous, and then they were removed. Turns out that the first edition, which is 1965, it seems that there is 5 editions. Someone who wrote a master paper on the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso has located that there was 5 different editions of the first edition. Anyway, this controversy, like everything else, there's controversies. But what was the controversy about? So it's interesting that the first nakuda about the controversy is that who began the controversy is the Steipler, the great Steipler from Bnei Brak, wrote in a parak of his in his Musar Sefer Chaye where he talks about Shmiras Shabbos Bichlal. He has a ha'ara, and in this ha'ara he says, he's making an announcement to the tzibur that in our generation there are people that are putting out works likutim similar to Hashulchan Orach, and he says, "Aser lismei chaleim kimilvad shemelaktim hayras lehatera kimuvan," that they're collecting psakim and they're with a agenda, I guess, to be makel from all different mikolashim to bechiburim from all different works. V'yarchayim asher rabbeim lav the samcha klal, they're not reliable. V'oid hein moisifim mishalehem, they add in their own 2 cents. Shibushim v'silufim lemeyos b'yodim or beloyodim, maybe it's intentionally, maybe not. Akol b'magama, with the agenda lachnas kulais b'dinei Torah kedoshim. He says, v'chas v'shalom lismei chachiburim keilu, you cannot rely on such a thing. The kol sheilash halacha tzarich levar mitoich Shulchan Orach, or mitoich Rabbi Seinu amakatz from kigoin Shulchan Orach harav Chaye adam haMishnah Berurah yotzeba umash loy nimtza mavur b'devrei shayne apaiskim tzarich lases sheilas chacham eitzel rabbanim muvhakim hamleim yiras Hashem. Okay, then he goes on, he talks about it further, and then he says, even though it has haskamas, michachne Torah ein zoy seimeres klal on the psakim. Okay, and then he says, I'm not being marich, but he doesn't say who he's referring to, but he chose in the 60s to write this thing. Right away it was known that it was referring to the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso, and interestingly enough, even as time went on, when various psakim were changed, he didn't want to take out this piece, even though it could be because he held it's an important piece, even if, let's say, he might have agreed, which we don't know, but he might have agreed to the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso after all the tikkunim on some level, but he didn't take it out because he held there's a very important point here, a lesson that one needs to be learned about writing halachic. Okay, so that's nakuda number 1. There was this controversy, and what I'm saying is this controversy is led by the Steipler. Fast forward a few years, and Rabbi Landau writes a kuntres called Bir Dvarim, which is a 17-page kuntres. He begins with the Steipler, so now you see now clearly that the Steipler was referring to Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso. He's also from Bnei Brak, one of the great gedolim of today still, and he writes a vicious attack on the Sefer. It's vicious, and some arguments are general arguments, which is beyond the scope to go through all the different problems that he had. And one of the problems you could see is how he feels how the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso is mityaches. He deals with how he talks about the Chazon Ish. This is one of the things that he mentions at the end. And he feels that sometimes he has a problem with it, or whatever he feels the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso has some type of question, and he'll push it away. And that's not how we're supposed to deal with the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish is the Chazon Ish. And you could see this is bothering Rabbi Landau and the Steipler, and this is Bnei Brak is very, very much bothered by this thing. So this is the background of what I saw about the topic so far. So now my point is that this is what's going on in these years. Because the Bnei Brak Poskim felt that the Chazon Ish is not being justified properly, but being presented in halacha l'maisa, and the Mishnah Berurah also, even though the Shmiras Shabbos Kihilchoso is a baki nifla, Mishnah Berurah quotes it many times, but it's being also there's other Seforim being used, and it's not the Mishnah Berurah just and the Chazon Ish, so bothered them as the Steipler of the Eliezer. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky went ahead and Ish Maisa, he went and he wrote a chibur to emphasize. Here's the psakim of the Mishnah Berurah. Here's the psakim of the Chazon Ish. This is my theory possibly behind another motive why he decided to write the Shoneh Halachos.
Interesting. So I came across, there's a while back, David Bashefkin, who wears many hats, also has a podcast, 1840, and he did a series on Shabbos quite a while ago. And I remember he had Chazon Yaakov Matzin on, who, I don't know all the details. Actually, his son works for the OU, Rabbi Yisrael Matzin. His father, I think, was a bacher at that time. I'm not sure exactly where he was learning, but he ended up being the secretary, so to speak, to deal with all the letters and all the controversy that was coming into Rav Neuvert. Rav Neuvert, apparently, and Eliezer, you could talk about this probably more, was an Adam Chashvad Mo'ay, but also a tremendous Balmidus, someone who wasn't, someone who liked hacking around. And I think he wanted to dress. You tell me, I think you listened to the podcast, you looked over the transcript, and he talks about this over there.
Yeah. So it's interesting is that when you sent me to this source that he says that he didn't want to show Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach the letters that he got from Bnei Brak, these sharp letters, because they were also being Zalzal on Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So he sort of he didn't want to hurt his Rebbe in any form because he felt it's not fair to his Rebbe, so he avoided it. But I think he did. It sounds like he did tell him that there were that people raised issues, but and then he went and he fixed it up at least on some levels in the different editions to address some of the criticism that came out from Bnei Brak. But it was a very interesting interview that Vashefkin had over there with this Metzia that he found, the secretary at the time. During this controversy, he was a young bacher, and he saw these letters, which obviously I would love to see, and I'm sure people would love to see, but I doubt they're meant for the public eye. And also, Dav Bashefkin himself wrote an article about the chashivas of the Sefer Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso, how Lamais, in the end, it did become the classic, and it is considered the classic Sefer Ariyah. Now, but I just want to be madgish over here that I'm not going into, which is really what's sort of behind this, is that there's different approaches in halacha. It's not unusual that sometimes different poskim have different shitas. And when one learns, before World War II, there were many poskim. They lived in different cities, different areas. Hungarian Gedolim had one way of psak, and Litvish had a different way of psak, and Hasidim had a different way. After the war, this sort of became more of a melting pot, and communications became much faster. So Bnei Brak held their way for whatever reason, and with the Chazon Ish, and even, let's say, using the Mishnah Berurah, whereas Yerushalayim had their own messiahs. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was also going with that, and it's sort of unfair. Rav Neuvert was a chashiv, a yid. He wasn't stam a young whippersnapper, as they would call him, chas v'shalom, and he was a big talmud of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and it was known the psakim already then were coming from with the authority of Rav Shlomo Zalman, so much so that eventually Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach went and he went through the Sefer very, very carefully to make sure, because people told him every psak of yours is being quoted here. So he double-checked it, triple-checked it. He used to sit in a room, Seif Yamav, to check everything, and he released a volume of tikkunim and meluim on all these psakim. So there's different approaches. There's the Bnei Brak halacha, psak halacha, which is based on the Chazon Ish. Unbelievable. Yerushalayim, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, based on other mitzayros. Also unbelievable. I'm not anyone to be talking about I'm not taking any sides over here. There's different approaches. Rav Chaim Kanievsky was going with the Bnei Brak, his uncle, the Chazon Ish, his father, the Stiper. That was the Messiah that they were going. But at that time, the fight was, it sounds like from these letters, from this podcast from David Bashefkin, it must have been very Levitic. I imagine if the internet would have been around, it would have been even much worse. It has the nature of such a type of thing that could have happened. And today we see it die down, although, just to be Messiah, just on a tangent, that the Shmiras Shabbas Kihilchoso, when it was supposed to come out, and there were other diyunim, but there was a whole diyun when the newest edition that we have, this fat, updated 1,000-page version of Chelik Aleph came out, there was also tumults about how it's going to shift, if it might shift away from the psakim of Rav Shlomo Zalman to Rabbi Yashiv psakim, but this is beyond the scope of our discussion. But now I'm just going to talk about two more very short pieces relating to this. That relates to the Shoneh Halachos, but more about the Yachas of the Mishnah Berurah and Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and that is like this. Two of them they're just both very nice stories, and they're very, very recent stories, so that's why I feel that they're very kedai. Some of them people heard of already. Okay, one of the stories is like this. There was a mechon the way I heard about the story first was there used to be a newsletter, a Parsha Gillian that used to come out of Rav Chaim, relating to Rav Chaim Kanievsky, stuff that he said, stories, Torah of his weekly, and someone would once in a while cut a piece from it that he found interesting and he would send it on to me. And in one of the pieces, it says that a group of Avrechim, someone was about to put out an edition of the Psikta, and they wanted to know if the Psikta that the edition they were using was from someone Shlomo Buber. They wanted to know if people, I guess, they saw a picture of him, and they were very nervous that he didn't look from, and then they checked into him and they thought maybe he's a maskil. Could we use him? Could we use him for the main source of our work that we're putting out? So the story goes, they went to ask Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and without going into all the back and forth, basically Rav Chaim Kanievsky says it's a beferish Mishnah Berurah that you could use the Sefer. So like, what? Says not. So he said, we're not asking about the psikta. We want to know is could we also use his material, this Buber himself? So Chaim Kanievsky says, yeah, the Mishnah is a beferish Mishnah Berurah. Okay, it seems they went to look, they couldn't find it. So it turns out in Simon Tuf Yud Test, Sifkat and Beis and a Sharet Tzion, buried somewhere, it says Upsikta of Kahana v'chulu v'chulu. Then it says Umatzasi b'mevaer l'psikta shetama gamkin alav. The Chafetz Chaim is quoting that the mevar, who's the mevar of the psikta, Rav Shlomo Buber. So it says if the Kohen Hagadol, as we just got finished saying this week and last week, how the Chafetz Chaim was so important for, and I hope to talk about even more, for the Rav Chaim Kanievsky, it's a beferish and Mishnah Berurah. We don't need to go any further. So this was a cute usage of his incredible bekiyas for the most side detail found and buried in some Sharet Tzion, and that was what he said. Now the truth is that perhaps we'll talk about it more in a different angle, a different time. But so later on, what was the story behind it? There's a Machon called Zichron Aaron. And Machon Zichron Aaron has printed numerous midrashim, numerous chazals, and many of these midrashim, who was the one who discovered these manuscripts? Shlomo Buber. And they printed it. It seems that after a bunch of them, someone made a big stink and said, how could you print it? He's a maskil. Now, the truth is that this question should have been asked much earlier, because if you go into almost any shul in America, in Eretz Yisrael, in yeshiva libraries, most of the midrashi chazal that we have are meant, not most, but many were printed in the past 150 years by Shlomo Buber, discovered it. He was prolific. Who was he? He was this rich balabas, very learned person who lived in Galicia. Born in 1827 till 1906, he was from Shem Torah Mitzvahs. Yes, he did have to do with Maskilim, but he was from, and he was good. He was on good terms with many Gedolim. We have manuscript letters of him that were printed a bunch of years ago with the Malbim and other people. So this Mechon Zichron Aaron was getting nervous because people were making a stink about it, but the stink should have been made earlier on other from companies such as Vakshal, the Maznayim publishing house, also printed a bunch of Seforim, and no one really pointed it out then. But the truth is that people did point out other such issues, whatever. Okay, now just to assign two other pratim with this Buber is that there's two nakudis over here that I think Rav Chaim Kanievsky is really the main address to ask such a question. That is like this: Rav Chaim Kanievsky was familiar with all of Buber's midrashim; he used them in all his svarim. So it's not the main question is not only about using if he says something in the footnote, but it's also is he a reliable person printing manuscripts? It's problematic. Rav Chaim Kanievsky was familiar with them; he quotes them. I mentioned in Lamashal in the Sefer on tattoos, he quotes Buber of Medrash of Buber's, but he was familiar with all his form of Buber's. I imagine his library had all of them penciled up. And the point is, Rav Chaim Kanievsky was a baki nifla in Midrashi Chazal, as we've discussed a little bit already. If he found pieces that were problematic, he would have pointed it out, and right away when they would have walked into him, he said, Buber, stay away from him. It's not only that the Chafetz Chaim quoted him b'Teiris and Magia, it's also that Rav Chaim Kanievsky himself, if there was something problematic, he would have known about it. What am I alluding to? Is that there's many midrashim that have been printed over the years, and Chaim Kanievsky, they're collected in different forms. One such famous collection was put out called Eitzer Midrashim. Chaim Kanievsky at one point wrote numerous hagayis on them, and things that he felt problematic, he writes, take out this piece is problematic. So I have no doubt that if Buber had printed problematic things, Chaim Kanievsky would have picked up on it years ago, and he would have made a pointed this out. One other thing about this Buber, because of a personal nagias for me, was that a few years ago, I came across. I put out a work from a Yid Moshe Reines. This Moshe Reines was a son of Rav Reines, the famous Rav Reines. He died tragically at the age of 21. Anyway, this Moshe Reines, he was already at the young age of 14. He's putting out material and svarim and articles all over. When I began a project to put out his material, I thought it was going to be a small booklet of a few 100, 200 pages, and it turns out the volume ended up being this thick, 750 pages, and of material. While I was looking into him, I came across, he wrote about Buber. Turns out he wrote about Buber in his lifetime. Where did he get the material from Buber? And he wrote, I found from manuscript 24 letters of his to Buber, and you see from these letters, I printed them in this volume called Nifchar Ksavim, and you see from here this young 16-year-old guy writing to Buber. At that time was already one of the most chashuva people, and he's a rich gvir also, chashuva Talmud Chacham. Everyone gave him kavod. He put out many svarim. He's one of the biggest, most popular people in the city, Lemberg. I think Lemberg it was, but he's a very well-known person on all fronts. And you have the 16-year-old guy driving him nuts for all different things. It's amazing to see these letters. I printed them. And you see from the letters that he's still answering him, even though he's bothering him a little, what we would call maybe a little nudnik, possibly, with unbelievable patience. And he helps him, he gives him material, he writes this. Moshe Reines wrote the first essay while Buber's alive about Buber is printed in this work. Anyway, so I just have to mention it only because to plug my own self of something that I did a few years ago. Okay, that's one point. And then just to Messiah with one last point, again, to show the keys of the Chafetz Chaim, in the Chafetz Chaim's material, the Mishnah Berurah in Rav Chaim Kanievsky's world. And that is, this came out during the Corona. This was a tumult. Everyone was talking about wearing masks, not wearing masks. It seems at some point someone went and asked Rav Chaim Kanievsky about it. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky says, "Is often a bir halacha." What? A bir halacha talking about masks during a magefa? What's going on? So it turns out, if one looks in the Mishnah Berurah, in the bir halacha, Taf Kuf Nun Daled Sivav, we find Ayin B'Sefer Pischei Olam. This is the Magefa that was going on in the 1830s and onwards. Then he brings down about we're near your nose. You should wear some type of a form of a mask, it was quoted as, and you should have something smelling good, so you should be able to deal with the breath because it's people complaining, you have to wear a mask. And it's problematic. So where was this? This was also buried in a bir halacha in Taf Kuf Nun Daled. This is in Hilchos Tisha B'Av area where he talks about it. So yes, someone went ahead and wrote a whole article about this. During Corona, many millions of articles came out about all different Brotim, but this was a famous thing. The keys from Rav Chaim Kanievsky, somewhere out of the ordinary that he found. He opens up his bir halacha, locates it. Now, just to be Messiah, because this is, once you're talking about this chibur, and it played a role, is that this Pischei Olam is actually one of the hidden sources of the Mishnah Berurah. It's first printed in 1901. It's an incredible, massive work on Orach Chaim. This is one volume. There's another volume also. Rav Shlomo Buber in his Askama already writes that we already know from this Dayan, this Chashuv Gadol, wrote numerous works beforehand with tremendous Askamas. This is Seif Yamav. He's writing this work. He says, Sefer Yaakov v'Nechmad Rava Kamos v'Rava Eichos v'Zikni Tamlilu Chachamim Kol Zman Shem Zekenim Chachman Noisefes Behem u'Sefer Kayul Kama Chidushim v'Likuti Dinim Meharba Svarim Ikarim u'Mishaylos and Shuvas Ga'onim Kadmoinim Achroinim Al Kol Arba Shulchan Aruch. I mean, it seems that he really wrote on everything. But the point is, this has tons and tons of information from multiple Chuvas and different types of sources, even Hasidic sources a little bit. Excellent Sefer. It's not really used today. Very few people know about it. It is available on Hebrew books, but the Chafetz Chaim did know about it. He used it openly a few times, and it seems also other times. He had other Seforim of his, in Hilchos Tefillin, he quotes a different Sefer of his, and just Bechlal, the Stipler also has two interesting things. In the Archas Rabbeinu, at one point I see that the Stipler really liked Sefer Malaktim, such as, he says, he brings down, what was an example? The Pischei Olam on Orach Chaim. Elsewhere, he brings down that the Stipler said that the Pischei Olam had problems with his vision, but he made a promise that if he's able to finish up a Sefer, and he finished up a Sefer, and he got back. It seems he got back his Re'iyah. The Stipler brings it down in a different place. They bring it down from the Stipler in the Archas Rabbeinu. All in all, I would say is it's another tool. It's kedai to be aware of, and as I said, it was used by the Mishnah Berurah, and this Rav Chaim Kanievsky, again, when he was asked during the Corona, all the different questions that he was asked, he said, it's often a Mishnah Berurah. So not only was he writing the Shoneh Halachos, he knew the Mishnah Berurah, even the most side pieces of information, the names of people quoted, etc., etc.
Thank you very much. A lot of fascinating material. Looks like we've kept this conversation to around the 45-minute mark. What's next on your agenda, Rabbi Brodt?
It's a good chance that we will continue with the Derech Emunah in the next series, in the next episode of the series, continuing with the world of halacha of Rav Chaim Kanievsky.
Okay, looking forward. If you're still listening, if you have any questions or comments, again, send either one of us an email, eliezerbrodt@gmail.com, shwedm@ou.org, and sponsorships are available. Once again, thank you to the sponsor, and the discussion should be a schus refuah shalema for Shifra Bracha Bas Rachel. Have a very good day. Thank you.